In the quiet dawn of the medieval world, mist drifts low across fields and forests, and the first sound to rise is not the clang of iron or the call of bells, but the soft living hum of bees moving through cold air around stone monasteries and timber villages. These small creatures are not seen as insects, but as sacred workers born of nature and guided by divine order. Their hives rest near herb gardens and wild meadows, places where healers, monks, and peasants pass each day, knowing that within the dark comb lies more than sweetness. Bees are understood as keepers of balance, turning flowers into substances that heal, preserve, and protect. In a time when illness meant death and winter meant hunger, honey is thick and golden medicine, sealing wounds, soothing coughs, and keeping food alive through months of frost. Wax burns clean in chapels and homes, its steady flame trusted for prayer, surgery, and night work, while propolis scraped from the hive is crushed into salves believed to draw sickness from the body. Medieval people do not separate faith from medicine or nature from survival. They believe bees know secrets humans cannot, that they gather health from forests untouched by sin and return it as gifts meant to be respected, not wasted. Beekeepers move slowly, speak softly, and treat hives like living households, passing knowledge by memory and ritual rather than ink. As smoke curls upward and wooden tools hum against rough hands, the truth settles in quietly that in this world healing begins not with words or books, but with wings, wax, prayer, and the ancient understanding that life itself is fragile and must be guarded by even the smallest hands. This section deepens the story by moving from belief into lived experience, showing how medieval medicine functioned inside everyday struggle rather than formal institutions. It explains how bee products became central to healing, because they worked in a world without refrigeration, antibiotics, or sterile tools. Honey was used not out of tradition alone, but because people saw wounds close slower, infections spread less, and food last longer when bees had touched it. The explanation flows through infirmaries, kitchens, and battlefield camps, where monks warmed honey over fire, healers mixed it with herbs, and soldiers pressed it into cuts while candles burned low nearby. This part highlights how knowledge was built through repetition and survival rather than theory, showing that medieval people trusted what endured across generations. It also explores how bees connected medicine to the land itself, because every cure depended on local flowers, seasons, and whether a harsh winter or failed bloom meant sickness, famine, and fear, making beekeeping an act of protection rather than profit. The explanation emphasizes how women, healers, monks, and village elders all shared this knowledge, orally shaping a quiet medical system that existed alongside prayer and superstition. By the end, this part makes clear that medieval medicine was not crude guesswork, but an adaptive living practice, shaped by observation, patience, and necessity. Bees were not symbols here, but partners whose labor quietly stood between life and decay in a world where survival depended on reading nature correctly and respecting its limits. This movement of the story turns toward tension and loss, revealing how fragile this ancient relationship truly was as the medieval world began to change. It explains how growing cities, expanding trade, and the hunger for profit slowly altered the way bees were treated and understood. As forests were cleared and fields narrowed into single crops, the diversity that once fed the hives began to disappear, and with it, the quiet reliability of bee medicine. This section flows through crowded marketplaces and rising stone towns, where honey becomes a commodity measured, weighed, and taxed rather than a shared safeguard of health. The explanation shows how written medical texts imported from distant centers began to replace oral knowledge, pushing folk healers and monastic practices into shadow. Even though their remedies continued to work, bees were slowly reduced from sacred partners to resources. Controlled by guilds and lords, and the connection between land season and healing weaken, the passage also touches on how fear replaced reverence. As plagues spread and people searched for answers in authority rather than observation, by the end of this section, the audience feels a sense of warning that something essential is being lost, not because bees failed, but because human systems changed faster than nature could adapt the ancient balance that once kept communities alive begins to fracture, showing that the decline of bee medicine was not sudden, but the result of forgetting patience, respect, and the slow wisdom of the natural world. This final stretch of explanation turns reflective and quietly haunting, drawing a line from the medieval past into the modern world without breaking the cinematic spell. It explains how the disappearance of bee-based medicine was not a triumph of progress, but a narrowing of understanding as industrial methods promised speed, control, and certainty, while abandoning the intimate relationship between humans and the living landscape. The flow moves through empty monasteries, silent hives, and ruined gardens, where once every season carried meaning and responsibility. It suggests that what was lost was not just remedies, but a way of listening to nature, a patience that accepted limits and cycles rather than fighting them. This part emphasizes that medieval people survived not because they conquered illness, but because they worked alongside forces they respected. Bees were central to that philosophy, teaching communities that health came from balance, diversity, and restraint. As the explanation settles, it invites the audience to recognize echoes of the past in modern fears about fragile ecosystems, declining pollinators, and medicine that treats symptoms but forgets origins. The ending reinforces the idea that medieval bee medicine was never primitive superstition, but an early form of ecological wisdom, one that understood healing as something grown, not manufactured. By the close, the story feels complete, not with nostalgia, but with quiet responsibility, leaving the listener aware that the smallest creatures once carried the weight of human survival and may still hold lessons, if we are willing to remember how to watch, wait, and protect what keeps us alive. The closing explanation brings the story inward, turning the weight of history into a personal realization that lingers long after the images fade. It explains how the medieval relationship with bees was ultimately a reflection of how people understood their own vulnerability and place in the world. Bees were trusted because they worked slowly, collectively, and without excess, and this mirrored how survival itself was meant to function. This section flows through imagined echoes of the past, the sound of hives near sleeping villages, the warmth of candlelight on stone walls, the scent of honeyed salves pressed into tired hands. It suggests that medieval medicine endured not because it was perfect, but because it was humble, accepting uncertainty and working with what the land offered. The explanation makes clear that forgetting bee medicine also meant forgetting restraint, gratitude, and interdependence. By the end, this part gently reframes the entire story, not as a lesson about the past, but as a warning wrapped in memory, reminding the listener that modern strength often hides modern fragility. The final feeling is not instruction or nostalgia, but awareness that human survival has always rested on invisible labor and fragile systems, and that once people knew this deeply, the story closes with the understanding that bees never stopped producing medicine, only humans stopped knowing how to recognize it. In that silence between past and present lies the question of whether remembering might still change what comes next.